early October 2025, the once bustling streets of Simferopol and Sevastopol fell eerily silent. Gas stations across Crimea stood deserted, their pumps sealed, and signs reading "No gasoline." How did the Kremlin's prized peninsula, once promised prosperity, end up rationing fuel like a wartime relic? For more than 2 million residents, daily life has turned into a scavenger hunt for gasoline. Half of all filling stations on the peninsula, according to Kommersant's latest report, have completely halted sales. Drivers now line up for hours with rusted jerrycans, sometimes returning home empty-handed and furious. The price of remaining fuel has soared beyond R80 per liter, a burden unbearable for those earning the average local wage. In desperation, authorities revived a ration card system, allowing only 20 liters per person. From a domino effect analysis perspective, this crisis began with what seemed a small disruption, the loss of a few strategic storage terminals. Yet that single blow collapsed a chain feeding more than 60,000 Russian troops and every civilian vehicle on the peninsula. Without those storage hubs, even emergency services struggle to function. The absence of fuel, once limited to a few cities, now ripples outward, paralyzing public transport, agriculture, and commerce. Minibuses are overcrowded, taxis grounded, and farmers unable to harvest fields because tractors sit idle. Western observers note that the breakdown mirrors what economists call systemic fragility. When one component fails, the entire system unravels. DW's defense correspondent writes that Crimea's dependence on a single lifeline through the Kerch Bridge made the region a logistical time bomb. When Ukraine began striking depots in Feodosia and Sevastopol earlier this year, it triggered a domino reaction from which the Kremlin has yet to recover. Inside the cities, the social fabric itself is fraying. Residents use encrypted telegram groups to track fuel deliveries. Rumors of a tanker's arrival spread like wildfire, sending hundreds of cars racing to stations that often turn out empty. Meanwhile, an emerging black market thrives. Those who don't use their full rations sell coupons at up to 10 times the official rate. In effect, gasoline has become currency. Local police turn a blind eye, either overwhelmed or complicit, while criminal groups seize the opportunity to control distribution. An opportunity cost analysis reveals a deeper tragedy. Every liter the Kremlin diverts to Crimea means less fuel for frontline logistics in southern Ukraine. To keep military convoys operational, Moscow must sacrifice domestic stability, forcing civilians to endure shortages. The irony, as noted by Al Jazeera's military analyst Marcus Fielding, is striking. Russia's attempt to sustain its occupation is draining the very lifeblood needed to maintain control. Public trust is eroding fast. Sergei Aksyonov, the Kremlin-appointed head of Crimea, initially dismissed the situation as temporary logistics issues. But his repeated broken promises, AI-95 arriving in 2 days, AI-92 in 2 weeks, have shattered credibility. On September 29, 2025, the Soviet-style rationing system officially came into force, an image that instantly went viral on social media and became symbolic of Russia's regression. What truly unsettles analysts, however, is not the shortage itself, but what it signals. In an age when Russia boasts about hypersonic missiles and energy dominance, its citizens are queuing for gasoline. Has the empire of oil truly run dry at home? Meanwhile, deep in Ukraine's military command centers, new drone operations were already being planned, operations that would hit the very arteries keeping Crimea alive. And as the peninsula plunged deeper into crisis, the next phase of Kiev's strategy was about to unfold. By mid-October 2025, satellite imagery confirmed what many had suspected: 2 of Crimea's largest fuel arteries had gone dark. The once gleaming oil terminals in Feodosia and Sevastopol, long regarded as the peninsula's lungs, were now smoldering ruins. Could Ukraine's precision drone campaign have permanently choked off the Russian war machine's southern lifeline. This was no accident of war. Kiev's deep strike campaign, as dubbed by Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, was a calculated effort to paralyze the Kremlin's logistics network without firing a single artillery shell at civilians. According to Reuters, over 85 high-value targets across occupied territory and southern Russia had been struck in just 8 weeks, including 33 military depots and 52 industrial fuel facilities. The message was unmistakable. Ukraine now understood that in modern warfare, fuel is firepower. From the domino effect analysis perspective, the fall of Feodosia's depot did far more than empty Crimean gas tanks. It shut down the region's supply relay system, which funneled diesel to tanks' naval ships and even field kitchens. Within days, Russian armored units near Melitopol reported immobilization due to fuel starvation, as noted in a leaked military memo cited by Defense News. Each depot destroyed meant convoys delayed, aircraft grounded, and food deliveries halted, a cascading sequence of failures that no reserve stockpile could offset. Yet the operation's brilliance lay in what analysts call strategic contrast. Moscow had long claimed Crimea to be an impregnable bastion of Russian stability, symbolizing strength and permanence. But each Ukrainian strike exposed that claim as illusion. The more Russia tries to fortify Crimea, a BBC defense analyst observed, the more brittle its supply web becomes. By over-centralizing its fuel infrastructure, the Kremlin had built not a fortress, but a single point of failure. Western experts describe the campaign as a textbook example of asymmetric efficiency. Drones costing under $50,000 inflicted billions in damages. According to the New York Times, the destruction of the Sevastopol storage network alone erased months of Russia's naval refueling capacity, effectively grounding large segments of the Black Sea Fleet. Every day that followed deepened the domino collapse. Meanwhile, the opportunity cost analysis reveals the political trap Russia faces. To compensate for the lost Crimean capacity, Moscow must redirect fuel from refineries in the Volga region and even Siberia, stretching transport routes already vulnerable to sabotage. This diversion means fewer resources for civilian sectors, agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, worsening inflation across the Federation. In short, every liter saved for Crimea costs economic pain elsewhere. From Washington to Brussels, NATO analysts were quick to note the implications. A declassified briefing by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, October 2025, concluded that Ukraine's deep strike model has achieved effects once thought possible only through full-scale bombing campaigns. In response, Western defense contractors are reportedly studying how Kiev's low-cost AI-guided drones could redefine NATO's future deterrence doctrine. Inside Crimea, the effects are tangible. Russian troops stationed around Jankoy resorted to siphoning gasoline from abandoned civilian cars to power generators. The once fearsome military presence now looked exhausted, literally running on fumes. Civilian anger and military fatigue merged into a single crisis of confidence. As one frustrated resident told Al Jazeera, "We used to fear Ukrainian missiles. Now we fear running out of gas before reaching home." The psychological shift was profound war fatigue transformed into doubt about Moscow's invincibility. Yet the full magnitude of this breakdown was still to unfold. While Crimea suffocated, similar shortages began creeping northward into the Russian mainland itself. What started as a peninsula's crisis was about to engulf the entire southern frontier. By late October 2025, what had begun as a Crimean fuel emergency was bleeding into the Russian mainland. Reports from Kommersant and Interfax confirmed that gas stations in Krasnodar, Rostov, and Stavropol were closing one by one while tankers meant for Crimea stalled on half-empty rails. How could the world's energy superpower find itself rationing gasoline inside its own borders. According to DW's market data, more than 220 stations, roughly 14% of those across southern Russia, had suspended sales entirely. The crisis reached absurd proportions. Truck drivers traveled hundreds of kilometers only to burn their last liters chasing rumors of fuel. Buses were grounded, farmers left crops unharvested, and city logistics fell apart. Yet the Kremlin's line remained the same: temporary difficulties. From the domino effect analysis perspective, the loss of Crimea's depots triggered an accelerating chain reaction. Each refinery hit in the south Tuapse Volgograd, and Syzran reduced output just enough to strain distribution grids across the Federation. Railway congestion worsened as Moscow redirected shipments meant for export into domestic emergency reserves. The dominoes continued to fall once the southern hubs failed. Fuel pipelines from central Russia began experiencing shortages, forcing military convoys to share transport with civilian suppliers. A former energy planner quoted by The Guardian called it logistical cannibalism. In his words, "To keep tanks moving, Moscow is starving its own economy." This perfectly illustrates the opportunity cost analysis. Each barrel reserved for the war effort deprives entire regions of electricity transport or agricultural machinery. As Russia pours resources into preserving its occupation zones, it sacrifices the normal rhythms of civilian life, a trade-off increasingly visible and unpopular. Inside, the Kremlin officials scrambled for solutions. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak's decision to ban gasoline exports until 2026 was intended to stabilize supplies. Instead, it created economic whiplash. Russia had been the world's second-largest diesel exporter. By halting trade, it cut 2.4 million tons of fuel from global markets in just one quarter, costing billions in foreign currency. Analysts at Bloomberg estimate the move wiped out nearly $6 billion in potential export revenue, a self-inflicted wound, at a time when Moscow's war budget was already bleeding from sanctions and battlefield losses. Meanwhile, inflation spiked. Groceries, construction materials, and transportation costs rose by 12% in southern provinces. The ruble slid past R120 to the dollar. The strategic contrast perspective reveals the contradiction. Putin had promised stability and fortress resilience. Yet the very act of defending Crimea undermined the economic foundation of that promise. NATO economists observed this collapse with both caution and calculation. In a closed Brussels briefing leaked to Politico, one advisor stated, "What we are witnessing is an autarkic empire eating itself. Ukraine doesn't have to occupy territory. It just has to make the supply chain too expensive to sustain." The phrase economic attrition warfare began circulating in Western defense circles. Still within Russia's propaganda machine, the narrative spun differently. State television showed footage of smiling citizens patiently waiting at pumps, claiming Western sanctions were to blame. Yet social media painted another reality: angry crowds, ration lines, and desperate telegram posts like, "Where can we buy AI-92 before Monday?" The Kremlin's ability to control perception was eroding as fast as its fuel reserves. For ordinary Russians, patience was wearing thin. Farmers missed harvests, transport companies filed bankruptcy, and public trust, already brittle, cracked further. What once seemed a distant war had reached their own streets, and still, this was only the beginning. The energy shortage that crippled Crimea and southern Russia was about to send shockwaves far beyond its borders into global oil markets and Western economies alike. By November 2025, the Kremlin's fuel bans and refinery shutdowns had finally rippled through the global market. Brent crude prices jumped past $105 a barrel, the highest level since 2022, while traders across Europe scrambled to secure replacement diesel. Could Russia's attempt to contain its domestic meltdown actually ignite a global energy crisis? According to Reuters, The export freeze pulled more than 2.4 million tons of diesel and gasoline from circulation, shaking supply chains from Istanbul to Delhi. Turkey, heavily dependent on Russian diesel, faced immediate price surges of nearly 10%. India and China, Moscow's key buyers, began quietly diversifying toward Gulf suppliers, wary that Russian shipments could collapse without warning. The dominoes were falling internationally now, not just domestically. From the domino effect analysis perspective, every refinery fire and every halted export train in Russia triggered cascading losses abroad. Shipping insurance premiums in the Black Sea rose 45% after Ukraine's continued drone attacks on Novorossiysk and Tuapse terminals. European ports that once handled Russian oil began to experience shortages of refined products used in aviation, trucking, and agriculture. What started as a tactical Ukrainian strike campaign had become a strategic global disruption. The opportunity cost analysis reveals Russia's impossible trade-off. To prevent unrest at home, Putin ordered fuel exports to be redirected inward, starving his treasury of hard currency, just as Western sanctions tightened. The Financial Times estimated that Moscow's revenue losses in the fourth quarter alone reached $8 billion, enough to delay key weapons contracts and payrolls for state employees. Russia's war machine, said economist Natalia Orlova in Al Jazeera, is now being funded by ration cards. The Kremlin was forced to choose feed the tanks or feed the people. This is where strategic contrast becomes striking. Putin's narrative of energy dominance, his claim that Russia could weaponize oil and gas against the West, has inverted. Today, it is Russia suffering energy insecurity, while Western economies adapt through diversification and efficiency. The myth of energy supremacy is crumbling, remarked a NATO energy analyst in Brussels, and with it, the aura of inevitability that surrounded Putin's regime. At the same time, the U.S. administration under President Donald Trump seized the opportunity to pressure OPEC for production increases, portraying the crisis as a warning against over-reliance on hostile suppliers. Washington's Energy Security Council even floated plans for a new transatlantic diesel reserve, signaling a long-term realignment of fuel logistics within NATO. In effect, the war's energy front was now driving Western policy innovation faster than Russia could adapt. Inside Russia, however, adaptation meant survival. Fuel smuggling rings multiplied. Organized crime turned shortages into profits. Corruption spread from regional governors to gas station managers, each taking a cut of the underground trade. Meanwhile, industrial output declined for the fifth consecutive month. BBC News cited leaked reports showing that several aircraft factories in Ufa and Kazan halted production lines because supply trucks couldn't obtain sufficient diesel for deliveries. The paradox could not be clearer. The world's largest landmass, sitting atop some of its richest energy reserves, was running out of gas. And yet the Kremlin's official media continued to boast of strategic autonomy. For Western analysts, this moment signaled a turning point in the energy war, the point where logistics, economics, and psychology fused into one theater. The next question was unavoidable. If the Kremlin could no longer sustain energy flow to its citizens, how long before that failure reached the heart of its political system? Meanwhile, as global prices soared and Russia's coffers drained, another storm was forming inside Crimea itself, a symbolic collapse that would strike at Putin's most sacred myth, the idea of an unbreakable fortress. By early December 2025, even Kremlin loyalists were forced to admit what had become undeniable: Crimea, the so-called crown jewel of Russia's 2014 annexation, was collapsing from within. Once a symbol of reborn empire, it now stood as a monument to exhaustion. How could Putin's most prized territory, once paraded as proof of national strength, devolve into a landscape of ration cards and silence? In Sevastopol, lines of cars still stretched for miles at the few functioning gas stations. The occupation authorities tried to enforce calm, but desperation was visible everywhere. Parents carrying jerry cans, pensioners waiting overnight for 20-liter soldiers in uniform, begging locals for diesel to power generators. Medusa reported that even the Black Sea Fleet's auxiliary ships were moored indefinitely, unable to refuel. The very fortress meant to project power over NATO's southern flank had turned into a stranded outpost. From the strategic contrast perspective, Crimea's unraveling exposed the hollowness of Putin's grand narrative. The Kremlin had vowed to make the peninsula a fortress of stability and prosperity. Yet that fortress couldn't fuel its ambulances or fishing boats. A BBC analysis described it bluntly: Crimea was supposed to symbolize Russia's return as a great power. Instead, it now symbolizes the limits of that power. The opportunity cost analysis deepens the irony. To stabilize Crimea, Moscow diverted fuel convoys and subsidies from central Russia, sacrificing domestic welfare to sustain a military mirage. Factories in Tatarstan slowed output so the army could receive extra diesel. Railways were prioritized for fuel shipments, delaying grain exports and inflaming inflation. Every ruble spent propping up the peninsula meant another hospital unfunded, another regional payroll delayed. Meanwhile, the domino effect continued its slow, destructive rhythm. As civilian life ground to a halt, social media became a pressure valve. Hashtags like "no fuel, no future" trended across Russian-language platforms despite heavy censorship. When Sergei Aksyonov's administration launched an anti-panic hotline, callers flooded it not with complaints, but with mockery. The illusion of control was gone. Western intelligence reports highlighted the morale impact inside Russian ranks. Soldiers stationed in southern Ukraine now heard from relatives back home that they couldn't find gas or groceries. This corrodes combat spirit faster than any shelling, noted defense news analyst Julian Lindsay. NATO strategists quietly concluded that Ukraine's fuel-targeting doctrine was achieving strategic parity without escalating into direct NATO involvement. Donald Trump's administration, while maintaining official neutrality, leveraged the crisis diplomatically. At a late November press conference, the U.S. president emphasized that Russia's energy implosion proves what happens when a state militarizes its economy beyond repair. Washington's energy agencies began consulting with EU partners on how to convert the moment into long-term leverage, potentially tightening export controls on refined oil technology. Inside, Russia propaganda struggled to contain the psychological collapse. State TV replaced stories about empty pumps with footage of holiday parades. Yet ordinary viewers stuck in queues for hours couldn't be persuaded by patriotic songs. The question now whispered from Simferopol to Moscow was unavoidable. If the government cannot even deliver fuel, what can it deliver at all? Still, as devastating as Crimea's breakdown was, it remained only one front in a nationwide unraveling. From the Arctic ports to the Far East, the same shortages, anger, and disbelief began spreading, and what followed next would shake even the Kremlin's most insulated elites. By the final weeks of December 2025, fuel shortages were no longer a southern problem. They had become a national contagion. Across Russia's 20 time zones from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, the same scene repeated itself: darkened stations, endless queues, and a growing sense of disbelief. Could this be the beginning of a systemic collapse, not just of energy, but of governance itself? In Moscow, drivers now queued for 2 hours to refuel. In the industrial hub of Yekaterinburg, municipal buses skipped entire routes due to lack of diesel. Even the once proud capital of St. Petersburg, heart of Russia's economic elite, reported rolling shortages. Officially, the government blamed temporary refinery maintenance, yet leaked internal memos obtained by the Moscow Times admitted the truth supply reserves had dropped below 40% nationwide. From a domino effect analysis standpoint, each missing liter of gasoline was another domino falling inside Russia's vast economic engine. Factories idled not just because of energy scarcity, but because transport bottlenecks choked deliveries of metals, fertilizers, and electronics. As the dominoes spread through logistics networks, output in multiple strategic sectors, from aviation to agriculture, fell sharply. Economists at RBC estimated that industrial activity in November dropped 8.3%, a decline comparable to the early pandemic shock of 2020. The opportunity cost analysis reveals the deeper trap. Every attempt to replenish Crimea's depots or feed the front drained critical supplies from central Russia. Putin's choice to prioritize the war over domestic welfare meant sacrificing the stability that had defined his rule for 2 decades. As Al Jazeera reported, the Kremlin is trading social peace for battlefield endurance. Pensions were delayed, salaries frozen, and fuel coupons replaced cash wages in several provincial towns. Strategically, the contrast with Russia's ambitions could not be starker. The Kremlin's proclaimed goal, maintaining a sovereign energy empire, now mocked itself. The supposed energy superpower was importing refined fuel from Belarus and Kazakhstan to keep its own trucks moving. Meanwhile, the state's monopoly over truth fractured as videos of chaos flooded social media. The image of an empire built on oil had turned into a symbol of scarcity and decay. Western defense circles watched this evolution with quiet calculation. A classified NATO assessment leaked to The Economist described the Russian crisis as a slow-motion implosion of logistics. It concluded that Ukraine's energy war had reached an inflection point. Every drone strike not only damaged infrastructure, but eroded Russian morale and strategic credibility. A tank without fuel is just a monument, one NATO analyst remarked. Within the United States, President Donald Trump's administration pressed allies to exploit the window of opportunity, accelerating energy diversification projects and strengthening Eastern European resilience against future Russian blackmail. For Washington, this was not only about weakening Moscow, but also about rewriting the energy map of Eurasia. Yet for ordinary Russians, these grand strategies offered little comfort. Daily life had devolved into survival routines, bartering fuel, walking miles to work, and praying for deliveries that rarely arrived. The empire's periphery was freezing and its core was trembling. As New Year's approached, one question lingered in the bitter cold. If an energy superpower can no longer fuel itself, how long before its political engine stalls as well? Meanwhile, the Kremlin still refused to call it a crisis. But behind closed doors, its officials whispered a different phrase: national fatigue. The kind that history has always followed with revolution.